Welcome to Mad Poetry, Mental Illness Reimagined. My name is Georgia Vrakas. I'm a clinical psychologist, an academic, and a bipolar woman. My fields of expertise are mental health, mental illness, and suicide prevention. And I also write poetry on these three topics. Today's episode is about stigma and mental illness. There is a trigger warning for this episode because we tackle issues of mental illness and its impacts on people who have the mental illness. So, what is stigma exactly? It's a negative characteristic attributed to a person when their behaviors are viewed as different or inferior to societal norms. So, mental illness is considered a negative attribute, devaluing the person who has it, and is viewed as lesser than the rest of the people in society. So the key elements in stigma, according to the World Health Organization, are ignorance, so lack of knowledge, discrimination, and prejudice. So I wrote a poem on this very topic called Madwoman, which I will read to you now, and then we will discuss. So I wrote this poem in 2025, Madwoman. I turn on the news and surprise. Once again, it is a story of a madman, a mad man who has shot, knifed, run over school children, students, coworkers, and some old people to boot. Best look as normal as I can when I leave the house. I do not want to be mistaken for a mad woman. Nobody knows I'm bipolar. Nobody except for my insurance agent who has denied me disability insurance. Nobody except the employer who refused to hire me because madness is a risky business. Nobody except the bank lady who denied my mortgage insurance coverage because I am crazy. Of course she did not use those words. But I knew. Besides that, nobody knows. I do not want to be mistaken for a madwoman. So, in this poem, I really talk about things that have happened to me, most of them anyways, and these things are not uncommon among people with a mental illness. They might have happened to you. And they're very difficult to go through because we don't have much recourse it's hard for us to fight back. So the first example that marked me a lot was in terms of employment. In 2005, I almost did not get a job, even though I was extremely qualified for, and my boss and his boss wanted to hire me, because in the health questionnaire that human resources make us answer before being hired, was honest, and I wrote that I had had one depressive episode and had taken antidepressants, but I wasn't taking them anymore. So they didn't want me to have this job because, according to them, it was really too risky. That what if I get on sick leave? That's going to cost them money, etc., etc. And luckily for me, I had amazing bosses because they fought tooth and nail so that I could be hired. And of course, I only found out all of this way later, like years later. And of course, I was very touched by the fact that I had a supportive boss and his boss as well to be on my side, but it was humiliating at the same time. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating that, because of something you have or something you're living with, you can't get a job, and that other people had to defend me. So that was really difficult. Another issue, other than finding employment, is keeping a job. As we know, having a mental illness means a lot of things. It means symptoms that are more important at times. And it also means that sometimes we're not functional. We can't work, so we have to take time off. So a sick leave or 2 or 3. In my case, since being hired as a university professor in 2010, I can't even tell you how many sick leaves I had. I've had several, and my job is never on the line. And I'm extremely lucky to have amazing disability insurance. So, like I said, for me, what really helped was to have this supportive environment that was there for me. And I recognize this is privilege. And I think everyone should have access to this and not be discriminated against because they have to take a sick leave or because they have to find a job. I think for me, this is discrimination when we are kept from getting the jobs that we're qualified for. But that's a whole other episode, of course. And also how ethical is it to have us fill out this questionnaire about our health history? Again, like I said, that's going to be another episode on those specific issues. But suffice it to say, there is a discriminating practices in terms of employment these days. Another issue that I didn't personally have to go through necessarily, but I know people who have, it's concerning housing. So having access to housing when you have a mental illness that's severe and you can't work, so you depend on government help. So there's people who are not going to rent you an apartment because the negative perceptions of prejudice they have about people with a mental illness, and sometimes even fear, since the majority of the population does not know what a mental illness is and what different kinds of mental illnesses and what symptoms are, etc. So they unfortunately have prejudice, and that can be a cause for being denied housing. And another experience, and maybe again, this I talked about in the poem, and maybe you've been through this, but insurance is extremely difficult to get when you have a mental illness. I couldn't get insurance on my, I had bought a house, and with the mortgage, you can get disability insurance in case something happened to me and I couldn't pay the mortgage. And I was denied that. And they were like, well, I'm sorry, they crunched some numbers and then some more numbers. And I said, no, we're sorry. And, really in a cold tone. And for me, that told me that was one of also a very humiliating experience for me, because I was like, I don't understand. I work, I'm able to pay this mortgage. I have a PhD. I was clutching at straws, trying to make sense of things and trying to make them see that they were wrong and that they were discriminating. And of course, all that ended up doing was, well, nothing changed. I was just very upset, and I was very upset, very, very upset. I felt humiliated. It made me feel, to be honest, as I was not a contributing, and I'm putting quote unquote here, I'm not a contributing member of society. So in their eyes anyways. So that was pretty upsetting. This was a few years ago. It made me feel like that I was lesser than the rest of society. And that's what stigma does to you. It makes you feel like you're lesser than everybody else. Of course, we have to look at stigma in a bigger context, a larger context. Of course, it's not just created out of nowhere. I mean, it's if you look at media, for example, media perpetuates the myths associated to mental illness. If you look at the news, and even before we know what's happening, if there's a killing or murder, people all right away think, okay, this person obviously had a mental illness. He was obviously mental, and even before any information comes out about the person involved, and the situation even. And that's just one way. Another way is through the news. That's how first was media. What I meant was the news. Now I want to talk about movies, TV shows, sitcoms. You watch this and you're like, okay, first, as a psychologist, when I watch shows that involve someone who's mentally ill or a psychologist helping people with mental illness, I'm flabbergasted most of the time, because they're exaggerations, or the information that they talk about, that they share about a specific mental illness, is wrong completely. So if I'm watching this and I don't know any better, I'll believe it. I'll be like, wow, like this looks really realistic. But in reality, if you just, maybe even just Google information about mental illness, you'll find more information about it than oftentimes those series or movies, etc. So it's a tenacious myth associating mental illness with violence, and this is why people are afraid, because that's what they see, that's what they're told. So they don't want to get close to somebody or talk to them or hire somebody who has a mental illness, and it's all based on misinformation. And what's really interesting is that, oddly enough, 1 in 7 people in the entire world, 1 in 7 people in 2021 had mental disorder or mental illness. So that's 1 in 7. That is a lot. And so basically this tells me, and maybe it says the same to you or something else, but for me it says that, hey, we're not that different from everybody else. We are part of the human experience. We contribute to society, whether we are working, whether we're not working, because our worth is not dependent on what job we have and how much money we make. So it is important, if you have a mental disorder, to know that we are not much different than anybody else, and we are not lesser than them. So the thing is, it is hard for most of us to speak out, to talk and have our voices heard and really heard and believed, okay? Because we have a mental illness and there's all this negative stuff that we just talked about that are associated to this mental illness or mental illness in general. So it's hard for our voices to be heard. One of the reasons I decided to do this podcast specifically on mental illness reimagined, and using the word madness, like sort of reappropriating that term and looking at mental illness in a different way, is to break the stigma. This is what I want. This is what I've been working for the past few years. It is very important to me to be able to change the dominant discourse, to change the narrative around mental illness, to show that, we are people like others, and we should have the same rights, and we should not be discriminated against. So there's the podcast, but I also have been writing in the past few years, on and off, letters to the editor or in the newspaper, opinion letters on mental illness, mental health, and asking the government to step up and play a bigger role, actually play the role it's supposed to be playing, which is making sure we have access to all the services we need and making sure that we are not discriminated against. So I will continue doing this, including through this podcast. I recognize this is not something for everybody. Like I said earlier, I am privileged in the sense that, for example, I have a job with a lot of support, a good disability insurance. I'm also a clinical psychologist and an academic. So I have these privileges that help me speak out without paying a price, without being punished for it. So I'm aware that that's not the case for everyone. And this is why it's very important for you to know that there are advocacy groups out there whose job is to defend the rights of people with mental illnesses, to amplify our voices, to have us be heard. So I put a couple of names, websites of advocacy groups, and you can go check it out. There's a Canadian, American, and so you'll be able to find one or two maybe that you think might be helpful for you. So I really encourage you to do that, because we're not alone. You're not alone, and these amazing advocacy groups, they care deeply, and often in those groups are people who have mental illnesses within the group, so they understand. what we are going through, what we go through. And some of us, like I said, go through much harder times, and others are more privileged. So I think we need to keep fighting for this until things change. And I know it's going to take a lot of time, but I'm not giving up. So that brings me to the end of this third episode on stigma. I'm very happy that you joined me today. And if you want to share anything with me regarding your situation, any stigma that you experience, any discrimination, or if you have any ideas on how to make things better and advocate for people with mental illnesses, I encourage you to write to me and share this with me. I'd be really happy to read you. So once again, thank you for listening to me read my poem. For me, it's a huge privilege that there are people that are listening to what I write in poetry. So thank you so much for that. So until next time, I'll say take care. Bye.